You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Usman Butt. New Age spirituality, seances, perennialism, magic, and Eastern wisdom. While we tend to think of these movements as something born of the social revolutions of the 1960s, they are in fact follow changes that took place in the earlier generations. The 1920s saw an upsurge in the interest in the world of the unseen, death, metaphysics, and challenges to both the materialistic worldview and traditional religions. The devastation of the First World War, which not only caused widespread disillusionment with old ideas, but left many feeling a profound sense of grief at the widespread loss of life. A new generation of men and women aimed to re-enchant society, but the spiritualist movements did not only take place in North America, Europe, and the West, it also took place in the Arab world. Not only that, the two worlds bled into one another, with Middle Eastern fakirs making names for themselves in Paris, New York, and elsewhere. What do we really know about these movements, the individuals involved, and their place in history? A new book, Holy Men of the Electromagnetic Age, takes this topic heads on. Joining me is the author Raphael Cormack. Raphael Cormack is an associate professor of Arabic at Durham University. He is also a writer, editor, and translator. His first book, Midnight in Cairo, was the history of Cairo's early 20th century entertainment industry, told from the perspective of its female stars. Holy Men of the Electromagnetic Age is his second book and our topic of discussion. Ralph Cormack, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Hi, great. Thanks for having me on. Thanks so much.
Well, it's a great pleasure for us to have you. I mean, this was a really fascinating book. I mean, we did a review of it in the Middle East Monitor, and there's a lot here to sort of get through. But first, let's sort of start here, with you personally. What actually interested you in even pursuing this kind of history? I mean, your previous book was on Cairo's nightlife and nightclubs and entertainment, which was also an excellent book. So what drew you to wanting to cover this topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fair question because it doesn't seem like the obvious next step to make after a book about cabarets and nightlife, but I'm going to sort of try and justify it as being so. Partly because, I mean, one thing it came out of is during the research of doing that book, I was going through the popular press and the popular magazines, particularly of Egypt and also the rest of the Arab world, and couldn't help but notice that alongside singers and actresses and performers, there were a surprising number of hypnotists, spiritualists, occultists, all of these different people also plying their trade at the same time. And so I kind of started to delve into it. And anyone who's written a history of the 1920s and 30s or sort of studied the period will know that immediately when you start to dig into anything, suddenly you seem to come across the occult for some reason, whether that be a spiritualist or a theosophist or some other kind of sort of slightly out there, as it were, belief. I find it quite hard to define the occult, actually, because it is this sort of huge morass of different things. But basically, the way I'm looking at it is a belief that beyond the physical world, other things exist that we can access and we can control. So anyway, long story short, so I started finding all these people and I really was just trying to figure out, well, what is going on with this? Why are so many people interested in it? And as perhaps we'll talk about in a little bit, there seems to be something particular about this period of the 20s and 30s, the uncertainty, the kind of trauma of previous decades that makes it a period that is particularly ripe for the occult. And looking at the occult helps us see some of the anxieties and the kind of dreams and hopes and fears and all the rest of it of people who were living there at the time more clearly, perhaps, or certainly very clearly than other places.
So yes, it's interesting because obviously, as you were saying, it's very hard for you to define the occult, but that's precisely what I'm going to start asking you now because we've come across a few terms here. We've got the occult, theosophy, as well as spiritualism. So my sort of question is, scholars have come up with these sorts of terms, and obviously to describe these different movements. I mean, we've had so many different terms being used. The French used métaphysical, I think, something along that line, which is a very similar kind of movement too. But I'm sort of wondering, what do scholars say about what these movements are? How would they sort of see and define them, at least traditionally? And because we're sort of sitting here and thinking, well, belief in the unseen is an old idea. It's something that's a foundation of a lot of religions. But within the sort of literature on this topic, there is a sort of sense that this is something that is separate from traditional religious worldviews. I mean, although the two might bleed into each other at times. So could you perhaps tell us, what do these different terms mean and how are they sort of different to what previously went?
Yeah, I mean, you have identified the precise problem with any kind of definition of the occult, and the one that I gave, the idea that there is an unseen world beyond the material that can affect our world. I mean, that religion, called pretty much all of the major religions, fall into that definition too. And so one answer is to say, well, occults, basically, occult movements are just exactly like other religions, and that's how we should classify them. But it seems to me, at least on the face of it, that that doesn't quite work. Just, maybe philosophically it might work, but historically speaking, there seems to be something different about the people who I feature in my book, so who we'll go on to talk about, I'm sure, Tahar Bey and Dr. Dahish, and other mainstream religions. So what I sort of basically decided to do was take these two people and look at their own kind of trajectories and see where they were picking things up on, as well as a few other people, and take more of a historical look at this than a kind of have a historical definition rather than a philosophical definition, which could include basically anything. And I start, and many people do start, chronologically speaking, the modern occult with the birth of modern spiritualism, which comes actually from America in the 1840s. In particular, it is assigned to these two, who then become three, but these sisters called the Fox sisters, who in upstate New York start hearing these sort of ghostly bangings in their little sort of farmstead cottage, which scare them for the whole winter. They don't know what to do with them until eventually they discover that they can communicate with this kind of spirit, and they identify it as the spirit of a peddler who has died and underneath the cottage before, and they are therefore speaking to the dead. And now there's nothing, I suppose, particularly new about that. And at the time people said, well, we've had hauntings like this before. But what they do that makes it new, perhaps because of the kind of political, technological milieu at the time, is they turn it into this whole new movement, which is then called spiritualism, based on the idea that we can communicate with the souls of the dead after they have died, so from the world beyond, from beyond the veil. And it takes off massively. I mean, within a few years, people all over the world are suddenly communicating with the souls of the dead through seances and this kind of thing. Actually, in Peter Hill's recent book about the sort of Syrian Michel Mushaqa, Prophet of Reason, he identifies that basically a year or two after this has happened in America, in Syria too, people are starting to do this. So it takes off massively. And although not every single occult movement that follows this period is philosophically connected to spiritualism and these Fox sisters, I think historically we can draw a line between this kind of explosion and then the occult explosion of the next century, really. So that's why I focused on, I think, the lives of people. I think that's the only thing, or at least in my mind, that you can do when you're talking about the occult. You can't bring in everyone because it would you'd go insane. So you have to sort of trace historically where people are kind of getting things from and where they're all doing, and it all goes back to that period of the 1840s.
It's really interesting as well, before we sort of get into the Arab reaction to the 1840 movement, because it's the idea that America is where this is being led from. I mean, today it may not seem as surprising to us if a trend starts in the US and goes global, but 1840s America wasn't a global power yet. It's European power at its height, but it's the America where all of these ideas are sort of coming in from. So why do you think it's America specifically, or what have scholars said about America during this period that has made other countries so interested in it?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a really good question. And not only America specifically, but actually this particular area of upstate New York, which has been given the name the Burnt Over District because there were so many of these sort of new religious movements. This is also the area that Mormonism comes from, around exactly at the same time. Well, number one, yeah, clearly there's something going on in America, and it ties in with what we say about the 1920s and 30s too, right? The idea that this is a time when sort of lots of things are up for grabs. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a sort of new world politically and geographically in formation, and it's at times like this that we particularly see occult movements. Why does it spread so much? I mean that is one of the great mysteries of the kind of spiritualist history. Why does suddenly it is not even just confined to America, it spreads across the whole world? One spiritualist historian who was writing in the late 19th century said, well, must mean it's true then. I mean, that's the only explanation for why it spread so quickly, is because number one, it's true, and number two, the hands of the spirits from beyond were helping it spread. That's not necessarily a historical answer to the question, but it's one. It shows that the people really can't quite figure out why.
Yeah, it's interesting because in this funny kind of way, it's sort of foreshadowing what America would become. So there's like the spiritualists got there before everyone else. But if we look at the Arab world in this period, I want to continue with this period just for a little bit longer. Well, just for one more answer at least. Because obviously, you've mentioned, of course, that in Syria, seances start taking off within a year or two of the Fox sisters becoming a sensation. But what was it about the happening in the Arab world, particularly obviously in this region, since we've mentioned Syria? What was happening in the background of this to make them susceptible to wanting to jump on this global trend?
Yeah, well, I will say, even though there are seances, and as I say, documented in Syria in the late 1840s, it's not actually really until sort of the very beginning of the 20th century that we do get significant kind of spiritualist movement in the Arab world. Perhaps you could go back to the 1890s if you were being very kind of pernickety about it. But it's actually, it doesn't take off massively in the Arab world at this point. It's not until the 1900s that it does. And maybe we could go there because that story is very interesting. And I actually didn't get enough space as I wanted to cover it in the book. I had to cut out a lot of the material there. I mention it. But the interesting thing is that the two big early proponents of spiritualism in the Arab world in the early 1900s are this one man called Mohammed Farid Wagdi, both Egyptian, in fact, and another called Sheikh Tantawi Gowhari, both, although very different in their styles, both united by their conviction in linking Islam and science. And so they wrote lots of other. Tantawi Gowhari too was very committed to educating people about, modern biology, modern chemistry, as was Mohammed Farid Wagdi, and both serious religious figures in their own right, especially Wagdi, a very establishment religious figure. And they both get interested in this idea of spiritualism being a form of Western science. Because we don't want to skip ahead too much. By the late 19th century in Europe, actually often in England and France, we moved there. This question of spiritualism has moved into the scientific realm to some extent, and people are starting to say, well, here is a thing that appears very strange, but equally at the same time, people claim that they're communicating with the dead. Let's try and investigate this scientifically and see if anything is going on. And lots of sort of spiritualist labs are set up, parapsychological labs, all of this kind of thing for people to test what's going on. And people write about it and publish scientific papers and so forth. And that, at least for Gohari and Wagdi, appears to be how it entered their consciousness. They're reading these scientific papers about it. And then they become interested in that because they see it as this extremely productive way of mixing science and religion, i.e. saying, like we said at the beginning of this podcast, right? The claims of most religions, certainly most Abrahamic religions, are that the soul survives after death. I mean, that's a central claim. And here we have European scientists investigating this very same question. So let's also start doing this. We're committed to science and religion. We're committed to this kind of investigation. Let's do it. And in fact, Tantawi Gohari, who becomes by far the most prominent expositor of spiritualism, goes even further and says, well, actually, really, this is the science that we as Muslims and as Easterners have more claim to be investigating rather than this kind of increasingly godless West, right? This is our science. Let's look into it.
Really interesting, because obviously this is a time period where in the background we do have creeping colonization from the West happening, and even if obviously the mandates that would come in the Arab world happen at the end of the First World War, but even by this period in the 1900s, it's clear the West is encroaching more and more into the Arab world. No surprise that it's happening in Egypt, because, of course, you had the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in the 19th century, increasing interactions between the two societies. But it's interesting because it also follows other sort of movements coming out of the West, coming into the Arab world, whether that's through things like nationalism, but also things like the other day I was reading about the rise of temperance movements in the Middle East, because they sort of see all this science coming out of the West about alcohol and its effects on things like eugenics, and they start adopting similar ideas as well. So there's a lot of movement west to east here in this sort of period. But I want to take us a bit forward, because obviously we then have the devastation of the First World War, which seems to be a key reason why so many people in the 1919, 1920s, especially the period your book largely focuses on, this seems to be a big catalyst for why people are so interested in this stuff. And as I sort of saw from your book, as well as, mentioned briefly in the introduction, there's a sort of widespread disillusionment with the old way of doing things. First of all, there's obviously a lot of trauma in society, as you point out in the book, because so many people have gone. I mean, we tend to call those in the First World War the lost generation. And at the same time, the old ideas, whether they be the material ideas, seem to have not offered people anything in this regard. And old traditional religions don't seem to have much to say either in that sense for this widespread grief, or at least that's how it's perceived. So that's how you sort of set up the sort of why these societies were so susceptible. But I want to start... but in the book you start in the West. I want to start in the Arab world. How does the Arab world experience this moment of the 1920s?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. Before I answer it, just extremely quickly on the question of increasing colonial encroachment in the early 19th century, I should have added that both Gohari and Wagdi were prominent anti-colonial activists too. Include that's also part of their whole intellectual makeup, and this is why I'm a bit sad I couldn't deal with them much more, because the way that these things, religion, science, spiritualism, anti-colonialism all interact, and their work is fascinating. But yeah, so, and maybe we'll get to talk more about Europe, but that feels to me like a story, as you've said, that people know to some extent, right? The devastation of the First World War, people searching for new kind of ways to look at civilization, crumbling West, crumbling materialism, searching for something new. Many people went to the occult, spiritualism, theosophy, all of these things. But the story of the Middle East is much less well known, particularly the story of the occult in the Middle East. It's some people have written sections about it, but as far as I know, no one has dedicated a book to the occult in the 20th century Middle East. And what's interesting about what's going on is you can paint a very similar picture to the West, or at least one that in some way rhymes with what's going on in the West. And that is the end of the Ottoman Empire, right? Which is actually perhaps one of the more significant fallouts of the First World War that people sort of seldom talk about when they're talking about the fallouts of the First World War. But this certainly is one. The Arab world, which was largely under Ottoman control, is now not, and is now growing under essentially colonial control. At the same time, as we've already said, all of these it's a time of huge intellectual change, sort of the increasing encroachment of modernity. Perhaps that means Western modernity, we can debate that has been going on for a few decades, but is really reaching a height. People are in the same, I don't know, I was going to say in the same way, not in the same way as they are in the West, but people are still feeling similar things, i.e. that the whole political order has been totally shaken, that everything is up for grabs, there are all these new things going on, and they're looking for something to hold on to. And I think it's at times like that the occult seems to rise in prominence, number one. And also it's at times like that that looking at the occult helps us see what the anxieties of people are. This is something I said already, but I'm sort of going to hammer it down. And so the question is, well, then what does the Arab occult look like? And what I've tried to do in the book is take this one figure, Dr. Dahish, as a kind of symbol of many of the broader things that are going on at the time. And he rises at the end of the 1920s. And he first comes into being doing a sort of fakir act. But very quickly, he becomes really a hypnotist and a spiritualist. What he does is his main sort of, and he's in Jerusalem at this period mostly, although he bounces around a little bit. And what he does is he puts his spiritualist medium, who is also his sister, who takes the name Antoinette, the stage name, into this hypnotic trance. And then when she is in this hypnotic trance, she is able to do all of these kind of amazing things which cannot really be explained. So if you ask her, what is going to happen in the future, you're going on a trip, you ask her what's going to happen, she can tell you the answer. You ask her who you're going to marry, she can tell you the answer, but also sort of slightly more mundane things. So like if you write something on a piece of paper and you can't see it, she will tell you what you have written. And the explanation that Dahish gives for this, as well as the explanation that other hypnotists give to it, is this is the scientific power of the spirit. The spiritualist, and he says, he's studied all of the books on spiritualism, and what is going on is that when Antoinette is in this hypnotic trance, she can pick up things from the spirit world, so she knows the answers to things in the future, she knows the answers to things around her, and it is kind of scientific proof of what is going on in the spirit world. And he as other hypnotists do, actually, they all put the name doctor at the beginning of their sort of. So there's Dr. Salomon, there's a Dr. Edward Oxuri, there's Dr. whoever the rest of it is. They all do this, and it's sold very much as the wonders and miracles of modern science. Sort of exploiting basically what is an extremely unstable and fast-changing scientific world, and the sort of comparison that is always given, which I think is a good one, is that of radio, which is at the very same time really starting to become publicly known. I mean, radio had sort of been invented a few decades before, but it's not until the 1920s and 1930s that most people have an experience of what a radio is. And what it is there are, there's waves, there's voices, and there's music surrounding us all the time, but we can never actually see it. It might be coming from Berlin, or it might be coming from wherever. We can't see it, we can't pick it up, but it's always there. And what we need is a device that will allow us to tune into those waves. And then suddenly, if we shift the dial, there we go. Great, here it is. And what the spiritualists in the Arab world are saying, basically, is that, well, they've managed to find the equivalent of a radio, and that is hypnotism of a medium who can then tune into everything that's going on, that's going around. So not only do we have this situation with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and with the sort of encroaching colonial steadily encroaching colonial power in the Middle East, but we also have this strange new belief systems and strange new things that we can plug into, so that those two things together sort of make for a potent cocktail.
So it was just before I go further into this, what was the significance of his sister taking on the name Antoinette? Was there like a particular reason she picked that name? Was there something she wanted to convey by picking that as a stage name?
Yeah, no, as far as I'm aware, no. So Daesh himself is from an Assyrian, like a Syriani family. So her original name is Yukabed, and his actually original name is Salim. It seems to me that the fact of taking on a kind of Europeanized name is significant. But the specific name Antoinette. So the other very big and famous hypnotist spiritualist at the time is this guy called Dr. Salomon, whose medium is actually his brother, who takes the name Emile, which may or may not be his given name, but I sort of assume it's not. And he has this very complex backstory in which he says he grew up in Naples, although with a sort of Syrian father, and then has come back to the Middle East and sort of puts on these very European airs, or says bonjour to everyone and this kind of thing. But it is suspected that he probably just grew up in Syria and then moved to Egypt and moved around the Middle East, but perhaps never went to Italy at all. No one's entirely sure. There's something about adopting some sort of markers of Europeanness, which is common to a lot of these hypnotists, partly, I think, to set them apart from another thing that is happening at the time in the Middle East and that is very controversial, which is jinn summoning. In a lot of the Middle East in the 20s and 30s, there are kind of legal campaigns against jinn summoners who basically claim to be doing exactly the same thing as these hypnotists are doing. They, instead of harnessing the power of Western science, they harness the power of the jinn, but they give you similar answers. They can tell you if you're going on a trip, whether it's going to be good. They can tell you who you're going to marry. They can tell you where your lost objects are, this kind of thing. And at the time, there's a big campaign against them. Lots of people are taken to court and sort of arrested by the police for exploitation, for doing all this kind of stuff. So what the hypnotists are partly doing is saying, we're not like these guys there, it very much in scare quotes, they're backwards and kind of exploitative. We're harnessing modern science, so that's different.
Yeah, I'm sort of half laughing at this too, because when you're talking about European taking on European identity in your book, a parallel thing is happening in Europe and the West, where, obviously you have people pretending to be Arab. You've got one story in there about an Italian who's not from Egypt, doesn't speak a word of, or Syria or any of these places,
Yeah.
doesn't speak a word of Arabic, who pretends to be an Arab and becomes
Yeah.
quite famous. We'll get onto that a bit later, but it's just funny that there's a kind of opposite thing happening in the West where people are pretending to be Arab.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
Right, it's a real mirror image kind of scenario.
yeah, but it's also interesting because we tend to think today about the power of AI and what that's going to do to our lives, not just in terms of our political and our economic life, but even our spiritual life. What does it mean to have, let's say, if someone dies and we upload their consciousness to, if you can even do that, can that be done? There's a fusion of human and technology, but it's funny because there's something similar happening in the 1920s when you think about even before radio, you have telegrams and those telegram lines where information is flowing, and then you can hear voices through telephones, and that produces its own sort of dynamics. People thought, some people thought, it, are you actually hearing the person at the other end, or is there like a spirit that's talking to you? Photography as well, are you
Yeah.
capturing someone's spirit when you take a picture? They have a lot of the same concerns we today have with in regards to AI. But what I want to ask you about is, of course, when we go to Dr. Dahish, he produces a kind of storm, doesn't he, when he goes to Beirut? He does a performance, and there was a particular Catholic journalist with a Catholic journal there, and he sort of reports in horror at what people coming up to him at the end of the show were saying about this performance. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about this story, about what was said, and why was it so alarming?
So in fact, it's Tahra Bey's performance that
Oh, okay.
at the time in the 1920s that alarmed people, which maybe we'll get back to. But Dr. Dahish, all of these people, all these occultists, I mean Tahra Bey and Dr. Dahish are the ones I look at, really alarm the religious establishment for sort of obvious reasons. I suppose actually, so Tahra Bey, who's largely known in Europe. He sort of largely has European fame, and he's. Should we perhaps actually talk about him now and then sort of get around to?
Yeah, okay. Let's start with Tahir Bey, how his story begins actually, before we go into this Beirut performance, because he earned a reputation. He's a Armenian, I believe,
Yeah,
or we believe he might have been Armenian, who grew up in Istanbul, if I remember from the book,
yeah,
but who's like millions of people at the end of the First World War is displaced and ends up in Athens, and I think he earns the nickname the Antichrist of Athens. So
yeah.
perhaps you can tell us a little about that refugee experience and how he sort of produces this man, Dr. Tahir Bey.
Yeah, so yeah, he is, I mean, almost certainly, like 99.9%, he is Armenian. Born Krikor Kalfayan in 1900 in Istanbul. Uh, though much more than that, it is a little bit hard to say. He probably seems to have grown up for most of his up to his teens in Istanbul. His mother maybe died when he was young. Perhaps he was raised by an uncle. Then in 1920-ish, he appears to have left Istanbul and become, as you say, a refugee, as so many people were, as the Ottoman Empire is falling apart. This book, as I said before, and I'll say again, can be read as very much a sort of what happened after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire book. It's There are many different stories about where he went between 1920 and 1923. Perhaps he was in Smyrna, perhaps he was in Cairo. He was almost certainly for a brief period in Thessaloniki in Salonika, and we know this because he was Charles Aznavour's cousin, and Charles Aznavour wrote some memoirs about him being there. But what is important, is that in the spring of 1923, he turns up in Athens as a refugee, at the time when Athens is a city that is inundated with refugees from the former Ottoman Empire at that point, largely Ottoman Greeks, but also a large number of Armenians too, like Tahrir Bey. It's a period of extreme uncertainty, certainly extreme sort of hardship for a large majority of those refugees. But unlike sort of many of the others, he, instead of sort of taking on the identity of refugee, he sort of takes on instead the identity of Egyptian fakir, even though we know he's not Egyptian, and maybe he's been in Egypt for a little bit of time, but maybe he's actually just reading about all of this in books. But he starts doing this show, which sort of basically remains very similar for the next 50 years or so. He can pierce his body and not feel pain. He can control his own heartbeat. He can put himself into a state that is kind of like a living death and bury himself alive for a long period of time. Essentially, he can control his body with the power of his spirit or his mind, so he says. And this ends up becoming both very popular and also quite controversial. We'll get back to, I think, at various times, the religious bit, but one thing that people say at the time is that this act in which he sort of is in a death-like state, buries himself alive, and then comes back to life, is almost like a satire of Jesus's resurrection. You know, you shouldn't be making fun of this kind of thing, of dying and then coming back to life, because that is very much the preserve of Jesus. And various other kind of people take him on. There's one particular dentist who is a special foe of his, and he gets chased around basically the European continent for a little while until 1925, when he turns up in Paris, doing, as I say, a similar kind of performance, but now with even more sort of occult and metaphysical explanation to how it works. I mean, he has a history of having learned with fakirs from Egypt, and that they've taught him the secrets of the East, and that he has come as a missionary to the West to teach them about their souls in the way that the West used to send missionaries to the East. Now the East is sending them back. And as we've already mentioned, clearly he is kind of playing on a lot of the Orientalist tropes of the 1920s and kind of exploiting them for his own gain. He becomes extremely popular in Paris and has at the same time a large number of people who are imitating him. So by the sort of 1926 or 1927, we've got all over Europe, most European capitals would have had an Egyptian fakir, a little bit like Tahrir Bey, or perhaps more than one, and including America too. So he's clearly hit a nerve somewhere, and something that people are very interested in.
Yes, it's interesting because when he's in Paris, he sort of develops obviously a reputation. He's highly sought after by Parisian society. Everyone wants him to be in their club for promotions and so on. And he causes a little bit of a scandal while doing all of that. Perhaps you could tell us about that.
Well, he's a man who's not averse to a scandal or other. But the one particular night, he liked to go out late at night, perhaps after his shows, and have a good time in Paris's nightclubs, as a lot of people do. And at one point, someone who owns a nightclub sees him and says, "Well, come to I'm launching this new place. Why don't you come along? You know, all the drinks are on me, dinner's on me. Don't worry about it." So he goes along, and then at the end of the night, which we're told is about 5 a.m, he looks up to see that the man who invited him is not there anymore, and he has this large bill in front of him, which he then refuses to pay, and a brawl breaks out, and he's taken to court, and there's a whole long series of articles in the Parisian press making fun of him, essentially, for saying that he can withstand pain, but at the same time taking someone to court for hitting him across the head in a sort of late-night barroom brawl.
Yes, indeed. But there's also a sort of serious side to all of this because, of course, as he's sort of rising to fame in France, this is a country at a time where, he's obviously being celebrated for his stuff, but he's also aware that as a refugee, Armenian refugee in France, this is not a good time to be in the spotlight for, negative things because this is a society that does have a problem with a lot of refugees and immigrants. And in fact, I think you cite, was it George Orwell who wrote that
Yeah.
thing about what was it? It was to do with different nationalities in France.
Yeah, I won't repeat it because actually it's sort of slightly unpleasant to repeat. But basically, this he quotes this thing going around, I think, which basically insults Greeks, Jews, and Armenians all at the same time, but says Armenians are the worst.
Yes, and it's a key thing because it's something about there's an anti-Armenianness as well as an anti-migrant thing generally in France in the 20s as well, and he's obviously aware that this could happen to him too.
Yeah, and he never really, I mean, he sometimes hints at his Armenianness, very occasionally, but he never really explicitly says, I am Armenian. He hides behind this kind of persona of the Egyptian fakir. But I think you really have to understand that he's an Armenian refugee in order to understand him at all, or at least number one, to have any sympathy for him. He's clearly been through a huge amount, but also to understand why he might take on this sort of exotic Eastern persona of Egyptian fakir rather than the much more kind of, well, despised, as it were, persona of an Armenian refugee. People, if he's an Egyptian fakir, he can perform in front of everyone. He gets lots of money to do it rather than sort of facing their approbation. And then, lastly, of course, the fact that what the Armenian people went through over the decade before he appeared in Paris, a huge amount of violence and death. He his act as as someone who can withstand pain, as someone who can return from the death, is a kind of reframing of the trauma of the Armenian people. Basically, I think that's a very obvious way to read it of what's going on, and not just so. It's not just playing into the trauma of Western Europe, though clearly that is going on. It's also playing into, on another level, on a less obvious level, Armenian trauma too, which kind of makes him such a fascinating character.
Indeed, indeed, I mean, obviously, this is a he doesn't just sit in Paris either. I mean, he tries to go further afield. He goes to London. It doesn't end very well in London because they shut him down. Makes it to New York. But what's interesting to me is that there's this constant need for reinvention through his story because he does, do well for a period and then he loses it and then he tries to reinvent himself. So could you perhaps talk to us about, this process of reinvention and why he had to sort of undergo it?
Yeah, I my interpretation of that is that for him, Tahoe, he's one way to look at him is that he is just a performer and he's doing a show. But and this is kind of partly the argument of the book, it needs to be more than that. Like the reason he becomes popular at the times when he becomes popular, and the reasons why he becomes less significant at the times when he's less significant, is that he isn't tapping into this sort of greater societal anxiety or fear or hope or whatever it is. So he needs to have an explanation, a kind of occult explanation for what he's doing. He needs to be able to say, I come from a long tribe of fakirs, and this is all about the secret sciences of the East that you don't know about, and I'm trying to tell you about the world beyond the veil, the kind of perhaps the science of the spirit, he calls it, which we don't know anything about. And if at any point that kind of falls away, which some points it does, then he needs to reinvent himself and try and find something new. So one interesting thing that he does in the early 1930s, where he travels to Brazil for basically a year, a trip that I've found some kind of attestation for, but have not been able to really trace in a huge amount of detail. And then when he comes back, he tries to reinvent himself as kind of having learned the secrets of the Amazonians and all of this kind of stuff. It's never enough to just do what he's doing. There needs to be an occult explanation for it for people to go with it. And then he ends up actually in Beirut in the first in the 1920s, but then also living in Beirut in the 1950s, and that is where he dies almost certainly. Even though I haven't ever found his death certificate or anything.
Yes, it's also, but he also ends up in New York as well, where he becomes quite big, and he gets into I believe, the crosshairs of Harry Houdini.
Well, it's Rahman Bey who gets into
Oh, sorry,
the
Rahman Bey. There's quite a few bays in this,
Yeah.
I should say. But they're all part of the same scene. But there is this competition. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this competition between Rahman Bey and Harry Houdini.
Yeah, and similar to one's Tahir Bey, so Rahman Bey, who is a sort of imitator of Tahir Bey, goes to New York where he performs on Broadway, has a pretty good run. Tahir Bey is originally Armenian. Rahman Bey, as I think as we mentioned, is originally Italian. And then Houdini sees his show and says, "Well, this is all just an act. I know how it's done." And he does it and performs it in a swimming pool in a hotel in New York, the Burial Alive, for an hour and a half. And that earns Rahman Bey some fame for a little while, but then it sort of fades away. And then the interesting thing is, and this kind of chimes with what we said before, is that then another fakir comes along, Hamid Bey, who had almost certainly been Rahman Bey's assistant and then sort of took on the mantle. It's kind of like superheroes. So you can take on the cloak of the fakir. And he performs for a while, but then in the early 1930s, he sort of realizes that, I mean, as I've said, just doing the act is not enough. You need some kind of deeper metaphysical explanation for all this in order for people to take it seriously. And he starts to take up with one of actually the most prominent yoga practitioners at the time, Swami Yogananda, who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, which was apparently Steve Jobs' favorite book. Steve Jobs gave it to everyone at his funeral, something like this. But he takes up with him and then starts to turn the act into something more of a religious movement, which he calls the Coptic. I can't now exactly remember. Basically, the Coptic American organization or something like that. I forget exactly what it is. And he comes up with this whole backstory about how he trained in the Coptic temples of Egypt and how he has got the message of the old masters, kind of classic kind of occult stuff, influenced by theosophy probably, and how he's bringing this message to the new world. Because what happens with all these people is that whether they're in the Middle East, or they're in Europe, or they're in America, they kind of adapt to their surroundings, and they show us, like I say, what people in those surroundings want. So he promises, enlightenment and success, particularly in life. A thing that you need to do if you're an occultist in America is not just promise people enlightenment, but also promise them success in their life. And so he started doing that, and it turned into a movement which actually still just about exists today in America.
Yes, it's also interesting because I think it's Rahman Bey who when he was sort of coming to prominence, he was actually interviewed, wasn't he, by a Syrian journalist who lived in New York, and quickly discovered he doesn't speak a word of Arabic.
Yeah,
but he survives that interview somehow.
No, you just got to really believe in yourself. It's great.
But this also leads to a sort of obvious question here, which is, for Westerners, what is it about the East that is so attractive to them in terms of this so-called hidden or esoteric knowledge that only these Easterners know? Why was that such an attractive idea?
It was, I mean, a very good question. My feeling is that it was just something totally different. I mean, it was exotic and it was strange and it was something not based on what they lived through. For a lot of Westerners, it's very anti-materialist. They were done with this idea of constant materialism. A lot of people who are drawn to the East are also intriguingly very anti-colonialist too. So they've seen what Western colonialism has done, and they're in some senses against it. So they take up the East as a cause. But importantly, and I think what these guys show, what Tahir Bey shows, is it's in large part it's a fantasy construction, right? It is not necessary. It's not largely based on what the realities of the 20th century Middle East or Arab world or Indian subcontinent actually are, but much more it is based on what the West is and them wanting something that isn't the West. So turning to this sort of fantasy of the East, which these people can then exploit, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting because they even talk about, because Buddhism also became quite a big movement in the West, among certain individuals, and they even talk about we need to think of Western Buddhism as a separate form of Buddhism because it's just entirely based around, what people in the West are looking for. It's very little connection in many ways to what has historically existed. So
Yeah,
sort
I
of
mean
push.
that's Orientalism, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, but spiritual Orientalism in a sense.
Yeah.
But what do you think are the sort of the traces of these fakirs, these Tahir Beys, these Dr. Daheshis, and what traces are there of them today, and what sort of lessons do you think they have for us?
There's two levels to that question. One is that so Daesh and Hamid Bey still that the movements that they started still are going to some extent. It's a little bit unclear to me to what level these things are going. Whether this is the numbers of 5 to 10 people or whatever it is. But so there are traces which I haven't fully explored in the book. I'm sort of more focused on the historical matter, but they do talk about them a little bit. So there's that level. But what I think for me, the more important level, more interesting level is the kind of question that we started with. Why did you suddenly decide to look at the occult after having written about nightclubs? And it's this thing, again, at risk of repeating myself, is the idea that it's in the occult. The occult is kind of the avant-garde of movements that we will see and ideas that we will see come to fruition in the future. So if you're a historian, if you want to see what kind of things people are concerned with, an extremely good place to turn is the occult. And I think looking now, you've already said it a little bit with this question of AI. Like people are extremely worried about this kind of technological explosion that no one quite knows what's going on with it. But equally, turn to the wellness gurus of today. If you look at the things that they're selling, uh, buying products that will end our kind of anxiety and our stress, and buying something that will make us feel safe again and will end kind of the worry of the outside world. I mean, I think we see in that too a very good kind of encapsulation of something like the spirit of the time, and the sort of how I end the book is by talking a little bit about what Jung said about archetypes, not to get too deeply into that, but these people, Tahirbe and Dr. Dahish, okay, particularly, but some of the others, like they're kind of like the embodiment of a myth. If a myth is supposed to represent all of the anxieties of a society, here what we have are two walking myths. And the fact that both Daesh and Tahirbe created these personas separate from themselves, and actually we can't really know what, in either case, who the real man was, because they lived their entire life as kind of a persona. That it's that looking at that helps us see it, and so that's the case for the 20s. But I think the same thing is true when you look today. These kind of new age figures, whether or represent something of the sort of spirit of the age in quite uncomfortable ways.
Yes, it's definitely, very interesting to look at this topic for those reasons, because of course, as I said, it sort of foreshadows what we today are looking at as well. But I do have my last sort of question, which is that, as you sort of opened by saying, the history of the occult in the Middle East isn't so widely explored by historians. I mean, it's interesting to me as we were sort of saying that, I started thinking of the novels I had read and where the occult does come up. So, for example, there's a Turkish novel called The Timekeeper's Institute, which is written as a guy who's a kind of civil servant living at the end of the Ottoman Empire. He joins a metaphysical cult in the middle of all of that. So there is a lot of background, and this novel was written in the 1950s. So there's a sort of trace memory within society, but why have historians not really picked it up as much?
It's a good question because it really, I think it kind of encapsulates so many of the things about the early 20th century. Yeah. Colonialism, modernity, the role of religion in society, which all these people are totally obsessed with. And I think there's room for really so much more work on this. I mean, I will just say that there is a biography of Tantawi Gohari. I think it's Majid Danishgar who wrote it, which is very solid. It and does talk about his spiritualism, but is not focused on his spiritualism. And there are some others. So it's Marwal Shakri, I think, who's written about science in the Middle East, has written a bit about these things. But I think that, I mean, there's so much more space for a really deep intellectual history of the rise of it. It might be not so the kind of book I would write, because it might always, deep intellectual history sometimes ending up being slightly dry. But there's definitely room for it, and like you say, it also brings up this connection between the Ottoman Turkey, Istanbul, and the rest of the Ottoman Empire, because there are clearly networks there that are happening. All to say that there should be so much more written about it.
Yes, yes. It's hopefully this will be a spur for more people to sort of explore this topic, because I mean there is some interesting research being done currently on contemporary movements of New Ageism. I mean, there was Ali Reza Dasturi's book on
Oh
the
yeah, on
metaphysicals
Iran.
and the Iranians,
Yeah,
which is a
that's a very good book.
very
Yes.
interesting book, but it really does mirror reading about, in some ways, what was happening elsewhere as well. So hopefully there'll be more research on this in the future. But Raphael, Cormack, I'd like to thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was great.
To our audience, before our usual sign off, we do have a special announcement, or I have a special announcement to make. Today's recording of Memo Conversation will unfortunately be my last. I am leaving Middle East Monitor after 7 years of service. Memo Conversations has truly been a special thing to work on, going all the way back to the summer of 2020, when we initiated this podcast as a replacement for our in-person conferences that Memo did before the pandemic. We couldn't have imagined, though, that this podcast would still be running after all this time, and how it has grown, the time and dedication that we've put into it. It's been truly enjoyable, and for our guests, we've had guests on from different fields. All sorts of incredible conversations have happened, and it's sort of my hope that we've spread a little bit of enlightenment through these conversations, including today's one. But I'd like to sort of sign off by saying, I would like to offer a very profound thank you to all of the members who have worked on this podcast. I'd like to thank all of the guests we've had for sharing their knowledge and their time. I would also like to thank you, the audience, for making this such a wonderful experience. We could not have done any of this without you. hopefully together we will, in a small way, make these sorts of conversations more a part of everyday life. And so I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in over the years. And yeah, I mean, it's been, I don't know what else to say, a great pleasure. So I'd like to say goodbye and thank you for tuning in. Hopefully tune in again for another Memo Conversation, albeit without me.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.